At the same time, China's Commerce Ministry has spoken out about United States sanctions imposed on Hong Kong. The US House of Representatives approved the measures in response to the national security law. The sanctions include penalizing banks that do business with Chinese officials. The White House says they're an urgently needed response and that the new law marks the death of China's one country, two systems principle. The US has already begun winding down Hong Kong's special status by halting defense exports and restricting access to high technology products. It also signed into law the Human Rights and Democracy Act, supporting pro-democracy protesters. Now, for more on this, we're joined by Simon Marks in Washington, D.C. Simon, China has made its stand heard that it's resolutely opposed to sanctions by Washington. Are we expecting crippling tit-for-tat measures then and countermeasures from both sides?
Look, I think it's hard to know just how crippling all of this is going to be. And that's partly, Steve, because we have not yet heard directly from the President of the United States about the situation in Hong Kong. The talking has been left to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. And it was notable that neither of those two men had very much new to unveil in the immediate aftermath of the security law being implemented in Hong Kong. But that's partly because they had already lined so many measures up in the pipeline, as you've already been outlining. So the White House certainly seems determined to move forward with those sanctions that would punish any Chinese officials, banks that do business with them, companies that do business with them, for going about the business of implementing that Hong Kong security law. But the United States has to take a measure of all of this, given the enormous number of US companies operating in Hong Kong as a global financial hub. Were they to decide to unwind their relationship with the city, that would take time to occur. And it's one of the reasons why Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, on Wednesday here, indicated that the US is so worried about Article 38 of this security law, the article that would appear to be applicable to anyone living anywhere who, for example, writes an opinion piece that calls for, say, fresh sanctions to be imposed on China. Were they to set foot in Hong Kong, they could, under the terms of the law, theoretically, then find themselves being prosecuted. So the US is concerned about the welfare of Americans in Hong Kong now and those who may choose to go there in the future. And it may well be that they're seeking to calibrate their response because they know that this is going to be a long haul, especially between now and the presidential election here this November.
Simon, I want to move away from Hong Kong. I want to talk briefly about COVID-19, another issue that the US government is also grappling with over, 48,000 new cases in just the past 24 hours. That is a new daily record. Now, it would seem that efforts to curb a second wave of infections have failed.
Well, we don't know that this is the second wave, Glenda, and I think that's what's so concerning to public health officials. I mean, Dr. Anthony Fauci and others on the president's coronavirus task force have argued that the second wave doesn't come here until the end of this year, the beginning of 2021. So the real concern is that we are still in the first wave. The White House describes this rash of new infections as embers from the first arrival of the pandemic on US shores. But across the country, in states like Texas, in Florida, in Arizona, in Oklahoma, in North and South Carolina, just a matter of 2 or 3 hours drive from Washington, D.C., there is concern among public health officials locally that they're not seeing embers, they're beginning to see a raging wildfire. And with the 4th of July holiday weekend almost upon us, there is concern that Americans from coast to coast are not going to do enough to heed the safe distancing guidelines that remain in place. President Trump said yesterday he's all for face masks. Well, that's an entirely new message from the President of the United States. Be interesting to see if he wears one when he visits Mount Rushmore on Friday here.
Simon, thank you. Simon Marks speaking to us from Washington, D.C.